Hi, all. I'm Gabriela Houston. Welcome to my show where we talk about storytelling in all its forms. Today's guest is Maura McHugh, born in the USA and raised in Ireland. She is an author of horror and fantasy in prose, comic books, plays, and screenplays. Her comics were nominated for an Eagle Award for Favorite European Comic Book in 2012 and for the British Fantasy Award for Best Comic Book Graphic Novel in 2014. So, Maura, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me.
Your career trajectory is more varied than most, I would say, and you do so many things simultaneously, it seems. Do you see those different mediums as sort of separate parts of your storytelling journey, or do they kind of connect and intersect and feed into each other?
Yeah, they do. And but I don't think I planned it. So basically, I started writing short stories, and then that led to other work. People liked my work, and comics was the first thing that popped up that I hadn't written in, and that was with Atomic Diner in Ireland. And then from that, I sort of got an interest in working in lots of different media. Um, because what I discovered quite quickly was you develop different strengths of writing by moving between media. So when I tried theater for the first time, I actually found that really terrifying because there's no room except the, the dialogue and the character are central. And
Both.
when you write prose, you have a great deal of other tools in your, that you can use to describe situations. But with theater, there's no way to hide. And but it also taught me a great deal about dialogue as a result, and character, and creating character. And then as I moved through and I did a bit of radio, and then I would be swapping back and forth between like prose, and I now describe it as it's like a full body workout. It's like if you're a novelist or a prose, you've got like say great legs, and if you write theater, maybe you've got really good cardio, So,
Mm.
um, so the you build different muscles, you learn different things, and every time I move back from one to the other, I feel like I'm kind of strengthening an overall storytelling ability. But that's just for me, and I just like moving in different media. And some you're working in collaboration, and others it's just you. And I like both as well. I like to work in collaboration, and I like to work on my own.
Yes, because you've worked with Kim Newman quite a lot as well, haven't you?
Yeah, yeah. He's an old friend. Yeah, yeah. And we did um, Witchfinder, which is within the Mike Mignola Dark Horse universe, and that was a really great experience. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a great comic. I read it so
Oh, thank you.
before the interview. I thought it was really really good. You have actually studied script writing, haven't you?
hmm Yeah, I'm one of these really. I love to learn, right? I don't like getting degrees and pieces of paper, but that's kind of the way they formalize education. It's
Mm,
like
of course.
that's what they want you to do. So I actually have a master's in Irish supernatural 19th century fiction. And then I went back and I did a diploma in film studies. And then I did a master's in screenwriting. And I've done lots of different sort of little courses as well. So I think that I've got a couple of other tech qualifications in there too. So screenwriting is actually was a great thing to do because
Mm.
it's very focused on structure, and it's closest but not the same as writing for comics. So when I wrote for comics, I had the masters in my back pocket, so that actually really helped.
Yes. How did you sort of find it like adapting to, because while they're very much related, the sort of writing for
Mhm.
movies, and because you can think of comic books as almost storyboards for movies, but they're
Yeah,
still different mediums, and you can sometimes
absolutely.
see um I'm not going to name it because it would be mean, but like sometimes you see a comic book that's adapted to screen, and if it's too close to the comic book, it doesn't quite work. It doesn't quite translate in the same way. And then, so there are those differences. Like, how do you approach that?
Right. So the number one thing as a writer is that you cannot direct a film script, right?
Mm.
So you are trying to, as best as possible, write your story without it appearing you're telling anyone what to do, because that's a big no-no as a scriptwriter. But when you write for comics, you actually can dictate a great deal more. It does help if you have a visual flair. But when you're writing for comics, you're working in conjunction with an artist and you're leaning on their ability to do visual storytelling. You're the writer, they're the visual storyteller. So often, again, the script is a suggestion and they may come back to you. So you have a page and you say 5 panels, and they'll say, well, actually, I can do this in a much more interesting way in one. And you go, great, that's your strength, you know. And that's what I usually do anyway. I always go with the talent of the artist. So, and it's much faster. Obviously, screenwriting takes forever, and you almost never. Well, you're lucky to get anything developed. So you might produce a lot of work and never see anything actually hit the screen. There's actually plenty of screenwriters in, say, Hollywood who are very jobbing screenwriters who almost never get anything made and then earn a living. It's just a very complicated process. And once you get assigned a director, they'll have notes. Your project can shift and change quite a lot once you're working in film. With comics, you have way more control. But you do also have other issues with getting it made. If you're working within someone's IP, you also have restrictions on what you can do. And it very much depends on the people you're working with. And
Yes,
then
of
there's
course.
just the things, the way you tell your story. Everything in comics is by page. I'm not telling you anything. You know this. It's on page turns. So you're always thinking first page, next 2 pages,
The
and
reveals as well, like where you're gonna
absolutely, yeah,
put the reveals.
yeah,
And it sounds like your sort of experience in comics has been extremely collaborative. So I have briefly worked in comics, which sort of dealt mostly with like IP comics, and it wasn't always as collaborative. So there was this wall sort of between the writer and the
yeah.
artist sometimes.
Mm-hmm,
And
mm-hmm.
was that your experience? Because you have worked within someone else's IP.
Yeah, I've worked in several of them, and that does happen where you deliver a script and then a comic appears. And it's unsatisfying as a writer because I don't want to dictate anything to the artist, but I do like if they have questions and then you can ask that they, you
Of
know, you
course.
can, yeah. And so my idea is that the work gets better through communication between the artist and the writer. Now, when we worked on Witchfinder, we had absolute interaction with Tyler Crook, our artist. He was amazing. Um, he was so helpful. You know, we gave him suggestions for character design. That's pretty common where you can show him actors and actresses you like. That's it's just a
Mm.
rough. And then he goes off and does his thing and produces amazing work. So then he would send us thumbnails before we even saw art. And that was super useful because that helped us see how were we on track with the breakdown of the story over the page count we were given. And then, so we have a sense of where things are laying out, and then we would see pencils, and then we saw inks, and we saw colors, and we got a letter pass as well, which I think personally is very important.
Mm.
Because I know in one comic I worked with, Jennifer Wilde, for instance, I got a page and I looked at it and I thought it was too quiet, right? I know
Yeah.
that I mean, that sounds counterintuitive, but
Mm.
I realized that it's a scene in which Jennifer appears for the first time, and there's this character looking at her as there's nothing to be said technically. And I said, have that guy whistle at her. And it really made the difference in the panel,
Of course, yeah, and in terms of like telling a story, like having that line of communication open, I think always improves the work. So it's not just kind of isolate, because people might have a different interpretation of a script as well, and
Yeah,
then, like you say, if you want to add something little, or for example, if you want to have that moment of peace, as sometimes you do need that, like
yeah,
very kind of notably in the Studio Ghibli movies, you have some notice that you always have that moment where nothing happens, where a
yes,
character just sits there, and and the wind sort of blows, and the grass sort of moves, and it's such an important part of the movies and of the the feeling that it gives to you, when you're sort of absorbing that story is so important. And if someone were to disrupt it because of like lack of communication, that I
hmm
imagine would be very, very frustrating.
yeah. I actually think a lot about words on the page, because a bubble is interrupting art. And that's the way I view it. So text should always be vital. And I try a lot actually to use no dialogue where possible. Um, it isn't always possible. We had more room to breathe in Witchfinder. When I work with 2000 AD, it tends to be, you've got like anything from 8 to 10 pages. So you often don't get a lot of chance to um, be quiet, but I always try and get it in as much as possible. And I have written scripts, not for 2000 AD, but certainly as challenges, I often write scripts with no dialogue, because you have to be able to tell a story without it. Um,
Mm,
with a film, you're totally dependent then on the ability of the actors, and or if it was an
of
animation, as you were
course.
saying, the animation. So
Did you find, like, when you were working with Kim Newman, and the fact that you guys are friends must have helped immensely?
yeah, yeah.
But when it came to sort of collaborating, and did you have any moments when you felt like your storytelling styles were slightly different and you had to hash out those differences?
No, we were lucky, and I was very nervous in that regard because we were very good friends, and I didn't want this to put an end to it. So no, we kind of approached it where I would do the bones part, but we had worked out, just to explain. Obviously, we had to pitch this, so we had pitched a very rough synopsis of the breakdown of the issues, the 5 issues, and then we had to start writing them. And actually, things shifted by the end. I remember coming to the end when I was writing the rough draft of the first one. I realized that an action scene that I had set at the beginning of the second issue had to be at the end of the first issue. And you don't know that until you start writing it. And that meant
Yes.
I had to put something else into the second issue. But there's a scene where they go to an eel museum. And that is actually just invented because I needed that space. And it worked out great, you know? So uh, and then what would happen is that Kim would look at these drafts and start building on top of that. And then we would do back and forth on dialogue. Kim is very strong on dialogue, especially because he's English. And it was set in Somerset, which he grew up in. And there's very specific
Mm.
dialect to Somerset, which he got. He was the one who got all those kind of details right. But we're both quite obsessive about details, so we had both done a lot of research. So, um, uh, yeah, so it worked out great in the end. So, yeah, you can only fingers crossed.
So you sort of touched briefly on sort of moving into comics from short stories. Like, how did you actually get into this? Like,
Uh,
did you?
it,
Oh, sorry,
I was asked to. I was asked to it. Yeah,
you were
basically, someone.
asking.
Yeah, yeah, someone who knew me, knew my work, and he said, "Oh, I'm thinking of doing this comic. Would you be interested?" And I just said yes. You just don't say
Of
no to
course,
something like that, you
of
know.
course, it's a
Uh,
lovely opportunity as well to
yeah,
to to
yeah.
to work in that
But
world.
the point I made earlier, I think, is that work comes from doing work. So he came to me because I was always already writing, you know, and
Mm,
he knew I was the it was good, I presume. So anyway, so that's how that happened.
yeah.
Yeah.
I don't think anybody would have put their credibility on the line if they didn't think your work was good. um, did you feel like constrained by the world of others' creation when you first sort of started thinking of the plot lines? Because of course, with IP works, and like for those listeners who don't know what IP work is when you have an existing world like like Marvel or in this case the Hellboy universe in comic books, and you are writing a story related to that, and you are constrained in a way, constrained by the pre-existing sort of elements of that world. So, like, did you, Maura, did you find that aspect of the work constraining? Did you sometimes want to move outside of what was sort of permissible?
Well, it very depends on the IP you're working for. So we had a great experience in Mike Mignola was very generous. He liked what we suggested. He had no issues with it. But you have to respect the world you're in. So you have to work with the character that's already created in this case for Edward Grey, the Witchfinder. So we had done a lot of research. We had read the guy. We had to get a beat on his temperament and his dialogue. If I'm pitching in 2000 AD, and Matt Smith, the editor, can just say, no, I don't want that story. So I usually pitch a couple. Um, and then he's generally quite good. Once he knows you know your stuff, he doesn't really interfere a great deal unless you did something he just said, no, no, we can't do that. But normally they catch that in the pitch,
Hmm.
they would correct that before you went to that stage. Um, I've had very good experiences with them. Now I have friends who've worked for the likes of Marvel, have worked for I know people
Yes.
who've worked in Warhammer. I know people who worked in lots of different Doctor Who, and it's very different depending on DC as well. So it's very
Oh,
different
sorry,
depending on the world
Maura.
you're in.
There was hold on, Maura, hold on, because there was an interference, and your video froze up, and the sound
Okay.
froze up for a moment. So let's give it like 3 seconds so I can find the spot
Okay.
and edit it. And if
Cool.
you can just go back to a couple sentences ago.
Okay.
Hi.
So I have friends who've worked in other IPs, such as Marvel, um, Doctor Who, Warhammer, even, and DC as well. And their experiences are very different. There's a huge amount of rules and regulations depending on what you can do with the characters, the dialogue you can use, the curses are not that you can usually not that
Yeah.
you can use. And then of course, all of these companies have different comics depending on the age as well. So fair enough, you're not going to be doing anything too crazy in them. So yeah, it's the most interesting IP I did recently was I wrote a comic based on the Evanescence song, um, and that came out this year, January or February. Sorry, too many comics to remember
That
sometimes.
is really, can you expand on that? Because that's, crossing from music to comic book form. That is really
Yeah,
interesting.
yeah. It's based on My Heart Is Broken Evanescence song. What happened is they said, it's actually a pretty common thing that's starting to happen where well-known bands, usually rock bands actually, I mean, Evanescence is massive. People mightn't be so familiar with them now, but believe me, their fan base is huge. Um, and people do these anthologies based on songs. So I was asked to choose a selection of songs, new and old ones, and I listened to a whole pile of them, and Amy Lee's voice is incredible, right? So um, I, I, I just had to generate ideas inspired by the songs, and the funny thing about this one, My Heart Is Broken, is the idea came to me immediately on hearing the song, and it was the one I liked the best. But I pitched, I'd say, about 6 or 7, and they picked that one, so I was extremely happy. And then I had to write the script, and that got sent off and got made. It actually was a very long process because
Mm.
the band has to sign off on it, mainly Amy, and then sorry, I say Amy. We're not, you know,
But
it
you're
sounds like we're
besties. That's all right.
buds.
Yeah,
No,
that's all
it's
right.
not quite like that. Miss Lee, maybe I should say. But and then it came out. It was a great. Yeah, it was really lovely project, but it took ages that project,
Yes, of
you know.
course. I mean,
So
with IP work, I've seen people have such different experiences, because it can be a lovely experience, almost similar to writing fan fiction, in a kind of this
yes,
very
exactly.
it's this very satisfying, almost like a kind of guilty pleasure sort of experience of really delving into this world that you're a fan of.
Hmm.
And then I have seen people work on projects that just became the bane of their existence for
Yeah.
years, where they got bogged down in constant rewrites.
Hmm.
And,
Hmm.
especially if that was work for hire sort of basis, and they had no great love for the world to begin with,
Hmm. Yeah.
that can become something that is quite stifling creatively.
Yeah, it can become a poison chalice after a while. I mean, I'm lucky I haven't had that
Mm.
experience to the extent you're talking about, but I have heard many, many stories. So it's the luck of the draw sometimes. The problem with situations like that is that it can actually start to really impinge upon your creativity, and it can make you feel, as you said, stuck and unhappy, and so, and this can happen in film as well. It's a very common problem in film, and this is another reason I work in different media, because
Mm.
if you work for prose, you're your own boss. Of course, you have an editor. They may make suggestions, but they're normally, if they're going to start making massive, they don't want your work, So I don't know if William Golding, who did Princess Bride. He wrote a very famous book called Adventures in the Screen Trade, and one because he was a jobbing screenwriter as well, and he adapted Princess Bride from his novel. But anyway, in that book, he actually talks about the difference between being a screenwriter and a novelist, and he said that the only way he could remain sane was to be a novelist. So he would go and write a novel, and he had complete control over the work, and then he could maybe do a screenplay and deal with the craziness of the film industry, and then he would go back to writing a novel.
Of
And that
course.
kept him, yeah, that kept him even, because it's very stressful working for film.
It does sound stressful, and it's just, comparing it to your experience of working with your friend on a
Mm,
comic
mm,
script, and
mhm.
having a close enough sort of relationship with the artist, where you can sort of suggest things. And then I imagine on film you're almost like work for hire. You kind of, you provide the script, but you can't interfere too much in the kind of, the director's the one with a vision
Yeah,
for your script.
mm, I was working with a screenwriter. I mean, another one of these many projects that never happened, and we co-wrote a adaptation of a fantasy series. We did a Bible, and we did a pilot, and technically still in development. One day it may happen. Who knows? 10 years from now, or it could be tomorrow. You never know with these things. But
I mean,
I
people
just
say it's a great time to be selling things to Netflix and Amazon, as long as you don't mind them canceling your show in the middle of a story.
yeah. I mean, there's so it's actually, I'm going to stop and talk about that. It's actually a funny time because there are things happening where entire shows have been made, like a whole mini series, and then
Mm-hmm.
it's been cancelled and shelved, and because either it's a tax write-off or they're just have no confidence in it. So this means that this has really not really happened in this fashion before. This is a new thing that's happening in the industry. I've actually just recently heard multiple stories about it. A film that got just canned, put off to one side. And that means, like, for a TV series, you could be working maybe 3 years to make
Mm,
it, to develop it, shoot it,
of
etc. And one
course.
of these was completely done, and then it was just parked. Now, that means that the actors, the writers, all those people who put all of that effort into it
It's hundreds of
don't even have a
people. It's
yes, don't
hundreds of
even have a
people, yeah,
calling card. Yeah, yeah, yeah. There's no way. As far as they're concerned, the work
of
doesn't exist
course.
anymore, or what has happened on some platforms where they've just removed entire shows which never were released in physical media.
It's quite shocking now, but like you said, it happens more and more because I think it happened to Batgirl,
Yeah,
Batgirl the movie.
yeah.
I don't know if it was completely scrapped or put in a kind of straight sort of streaming service as opposed to the theatrical release, which was the promised
Hmm.
outlet. Um, but it's always been a risk for actors, right? The
Hmm.
actors who might go and spend months in a movie and then all their work ends up on the cutting sort of floor of
Yeah.
and that's always been something that actors would talk about, as in, they've great early disappointments of their career. um but the fact that it can happen now to a whole series is quite shocking.
Yeah, I think Batgirl has never been released as far as I'm aware, but I could be wrong, but I don't think it was. That it got shelved, yeah.
Hmm.
And so all those people, that work is just sitting
It's just
in a vault,
sitting.
it's crazy.
And it's
But
especially painful because, if as a writer, so for example, say you produce a short story
mm,
and for some reason nobody decides to publish it, you can still find a way to make it happen. You can still, like, even if you put it on your blog or something, you
yeah,
can still put it out in the world for people who like your work to go and find it. Whereas if you work in the movies, if you work for producing a TV show, you have, like you said, nothing, no calling card,
hmm,
and all of your effort in telling a story is just
mm,
killed off by someone else's decision, and
yep,
it still belongs to them, so you can't even show it to anybody.
that's right. Yeah, because it's work for hire essentially. When you're a screenwriter, you're giving up all your rights. You have no rights to, even if you originated the show, you've
Mm.
usually the producer then owns everything. And now that is depends. Like, I'm not talking Hollywood now. You'd have to be like in indie films for that to be different.
Mm,
But generally, that's the way it goes. The producer, unless it's difference would be as if, say, one of your novels, Gabriela, got adapted, you would still own the rights to your original novel. You're
of
just
course, yeah.
giving them the rights to adapt. So that would be a difference. I mean, and Stephen King often talked about that. I mean, people said, um, "Oh, don't do you hate there's these bad adaptations of your work on the
Mm.
screen?" And you'd say, I still got the novel, you know.
Of
So
course.
yeah.
Although sometimes, like when you see an adaptation, like of course George R. R. Martin's, adaptation of, the Game of Thrones, it was such a wonderful show, and I think universally it was praised for the
Mm,
first few seasons, and then the last couple seasons, and that
mm,
disastrous last season.
mm,
For many people, I think it really poisoned the concept of the books, and they
mm,
might, even if George R. R. Martin does sort of at some point choose to release the final volumes, of course they will be on bestsellers list, like
mhm,
but I think there is a lot of people for whom that sort of bad ending of the show does poison in their minds the concept of his work, and in that way it's not entirely separate. And also, like when you listen to the creator of
mhm,
Percy
mhm.
Jackson series, after the movie came out, he was not active in the promoting of it at all. And then later, he sort of released this very long statement about why he didn't do so. And he felt very much like he was dismissed, and all of his obviously love for his own books and his knowledge and his sort of instincts were completely dismissed. And he felt that there were many decisions that were taken that were just not correct, and it was made into a more sort of teen drama than the original
Yeah.
series with sort of room to grow.
Yeah, that's what happens. And the thing is, it's maybe it's different as well. I mean, novelists. I mean, I've heard people who've been hired to write the first draft of a screenplay from their own novel, and they have not done a good job. It's a very, very different type of writing. And
Of
some
course.
some people who are novelists can do it, and others can't. And and there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, it's just
Mm,
horses for courses. But on the other hand, what can work well in a novel often will not work on the film and or the
exactly.
TV series. And I mean, it's sad when you hear a story where he feels like they didn't consult him and they didn't talk to him. I'm afraid I think that's fairly common. They once they have the project, they want to go on with it. They want to do it their own
Mm,
way,
of
and
course.
they're not going to really consult. And but it's sad for him, you know.
I think that like one of the main issues he raised was that he felt that given the absolute huge popularity of his book series, he
Mm,
felt that there was a huge opportunity to create a movie series, sort of in the vein of the Harry Potter
yeah,
series,
yeah.
that would uh, allow the characters to grow. And he
Mm,
said the decision that was made, it's a very crucial decision, the casting choice of choosing attractive teenagers,
yes.
older teenagers. I mean, I'm not sure how old they were, but they were, the kind of Hollywood teenagers. So they looked closer to 20 than they did 12.
Yeah,
Um, and he felt like that killed off any opportunity to sort of serialize it.
yeah,
And that is a pretty big sort of choice to sort of move away from the original work, and he felt
yeah.
his storytelling was
Hmm.
in that way compromised.
Yeah, absolutely. But I mean, they're doing the Disney series now, aren't they? Which is
Yes.
coming out. So it's very soon, or did it come out like a couple of days ago? Anyway, it's this month, I think. And so he's gotten a second bite of the apple, which is,
Which is more than most
amazing.
get. It's
Absolutely. But notice how much time had to elapse between
Of
the two of
course.
them. For in Hollywood standards, 10 years, that's enough.
Of course. It's I imagine, it's even more painful for those writers and script writers who produce a fantastic show, and then the story is not completed.
Yeah.
Did you have that experience of a story that was not completed because of outside?
No, I haven't had that. I haven't had that experience so far. Oh, but I know plenty of people. I mean, I've heard so many stories. Oh God, they're heartbreaking when you put in. Like I remember seeing a thing on Facebook. Oh God, this is about 4 or 5 years ago. A guy who was the day before the shooting of the film. Everything was in place. It got cancelled the night before. Just what you do. It's heartbreaking, and stuff like that happens. And you really have to be resilient. Oh my goodness. I mean, there's some crushing situations most people have dealt with, where you get messed about by people. And film tends to, I don't want to beat down on film, it's a dynamic, right? But it can be extremely hard
I
to
think
work
it's
as a creative.
really good to have this because I don't think you sound like you're being down on it at all. I think it comes from a place of like the love of the medium, and
Yeah.
it's really important to have those perspectives out as well, because what you tend to hear more is the dazzling success stories, and I think
Yeah.
it gives people a very skewed idea about what working in film is actually like, or what writing's like, when all you hear is the success of the different shows from sort of that come out from Shondaland. It's very it's very easy to think that, like, oh, I'm going to have this opportunity to tell this story, rather than understanding that your story might be not completed, or it might be completed and then never released, and
Yep.
which is
Or,
even could be even more
or
hard.
a classic one as a writer is you're fired off your own project. Yeah, that happens. You write the first draft, you've got it in your contract, first draft, second polish, and then they fire you straight away afterwards, bring in another writer. I mean, that
It
happens.
happens a lot, I
Yeah.
think. And very often when you feel that there's a distinct change in the feel of a series, and then you realize, oh, there's been a change made, and we don't know why,
Hmm.
as the audience, we don't understand that.
Mm. And
But
sometimes, shows improve. I mean,
of
they can have
course,
a kind of a ropey first season, and then the right bunch of people come in and they tighten everything up, and then the show starts to really lift off. I mean, we've all seen examples of this. It can go the other way sometimes.
of course. And like you said, sometimes people don't have a feel for the medium, and they go from writing their novel to trying to adapt that novel, and then they stay too true because they don't have that distance from
Hmm.
the story, and so they can't change it around. It's like I was thinking about, when you're talking about the IP work and retelling other people's stories, and then we're seeing a huge sort of amount of like fairy tale retellings at the moment,
Hmm. Hmm.
and the thing that allows that freedom of expression is the distance, is the fact that Homer is not going to come around and sue you for everything you got. So and that allows us to have those other stories. Of course, it can go really badly, where you feel like the original spirit of the story is really betrayed by the new poor adaptation. But very often it allows us that freedom of
Mm.
storytelling that is very rewarding for the artist, for sure. I was
Yeah,
going.
but I mean, there's so many different ways you can tell, like a Homer, or I mean, I was just thinking there when you were chatting about that, about Dracula, because I'm a bit of a Dracula nerd, because he was Stoker's Dracula is something I studied when I was doing my original master's, and Kim is, his Anno
Of course.
Dracula series. So we actually talk about Dracula quite a lot, but that is a show that has been unbelievably adapted so many times. It's done everything. It's out of copyright.
Yes.
It's had multiple TV versions. It's had multiple movies. So it is fascinating to see how one work can generate so many inspirations. And, fairy tales are the same as well. Yeah. It doesn't, I'm actually fascinated by what works are so malleable, and what is it about them And I think if you can hone in on the essence of what makes that story important and unique, you can actually do a lot with it in lots of different ways. But it's keeping that core element. That's usually what people respond to.
Yes, I think what you're saying is absolutely right. It's, you know, when you I don't know if you've read Madeline Miller's Circe,
Cersei, yeah.
um, and I felt like you said that it was just so successful. Of course, Madeline Miller is an academic. She is
Mm,
an expert in Homer's
mm,
works, and so she, you know, reads them in the original and she kind of interprets them
mm,
um, through the prism of her studies. But with the book Circe, which of course has a strong element of, like, you know, it's linked to the Odyssey and Odysseus, and it just feels really rooted in the original story, but
mm,
offering a different perspective. And I think a lot of people will kind of you know, we most people will not actually read the Odyssey, you know, or, you know, in the kind of in translation. They will read, you know, simplified, you know, short version of the Odyssey.
yeah.
They will watch a movie based on Odyssey, and most of those have they all have this element of, you know, the wanting to return home. That is the thing that people most often mention about it being such a powerful driving force. But of course, in Homer's Odyssey, Odysseus is he's, you know, the cleverest Greek, but he is cunning. He is not wise. You know, he is not Nestor. He is not wise. He is cunning, and he is really quite vicious when you actually read the story. And Madeline Miller, you know, preserved the element that we all agree on is really the driving force of the Odyssey, but also brought it back to the original text a little bit more. And
Mm,
I think that was
mm,
so powerful because it was actually, I would say, the closest sort of retelling of the Odyssey that I have ever read or seen. And yet it is so different because it kind of leans into what our modern interpretation of Odysseus's actions would be.
absolutely. It's a tightrope to walk sometimes, and you have to tell a good story on top of everything else, has to be
I mean,
entertaining
that
to
is
a certain
the
extent.
main thing, isn't it? I
Yeah,
think it's
yeah,
easy to get bogged down in the details
yes.
sometimes, and the main thing, it's interesting, you know, like in interviews when people ask like, oh, what are the themes in your book? Like, what is the message? And the message is you have to be entertained first. You know, the main that's the main job, because, you know, when you're writing a script, of course, if the first episode, if a pilot doesn't grab the audience's attention, that the whole show can be sunk by that.
Yeah, and there's a certain amount of uh, grab them in the beginning. But that's the same in novels, a lot of the time as in short stories, there's ways of grabbing attention in prose which you can be more subtle,
Mm,
but there has to be something almost on the first page, and it's the same. That's why so many movies start with a flashback sequence, because there's lots of action. You're thrown in at the beginning, you're going, what? And then it goes, 2 days later, 2 days earlier. That's it's almost
mm,
become a tired trope now that people do.
of course.
Yeah, action. But again, I would always recommend to everyone that they watch and read and consume lots of different media, because I watch a lot of art movies. And they've got a completely different dynamic in the way they tell a story. I watch movies from different cultures and TV shows from different cultures, and they tell stories in different ways. And
Mm,
so I think it's really important. And I read a lot of nonfiction. That's where I get a lot of my ideas from. So I think you can get very stuck. I mean, that is one thing. If your diet was just steady formulaic superhero movies, for instance, and hey, we all love a good superhero movie, not knocking them, but if that's all you watched, you would have a very kind of distorted version of storytelling. So
Of
you
course,
do
quite
need to,
myopic as
yeah,
well.
yeah, exactly. You really need to look around and think, like, how could you tell a story? From what point of view? Um, can you move things around? Can you set it in a different
Mm.
time period? There's so
I
many
mean,
things you can do.
it kind of nicely leads into the sort of next question that I had for you is that, since you studied film and script writing and, since 2009, you have served on a number of
Ah,
literary and film juries,
yes.
including the Shirley Jackson Award jury in 2012 and the, I cannot pronounce the French, Méliès
Oh
d'Argent?
yeah, Méliès d'Argent. I was on the
Okay.
Trieste Festival,
What,
and this year I was on the Sitges one in Spain. So Italy and Spain in the last 2 years.
course. And
Yeah,
you've also written a critique of David's Lynch's iconic
yeah,
film Twin Peaks.
yeah.
And so, how does the analysis of others' work influence your own creative practice?
Good question. I actually started because I did a lot of academic work. Um, I think my brain is always breaking things down. Um, so, like, I'm always thinking, I will preface this by saying, if I'm watching a movie, I've described this as it's like being in a cockpit. I've got a little 8-year-old version of me that's sitting in the front, and adult me is in the background, right? And now, if at any point I tap 8-year-old self on the shoulder, something's wrong, because especially if it's an action film or a fun movie, like, I should not be engaging while I'm watching the movie. My critical faculty is sort of murmuring underneath, but if it starts to fully engage, there's something wrong, right? Because I'm
Yes.
now out of the spectator experience. So yeah, it informs a lot uh, when I'm watching other people's work, and when I'm reading work. I sometimes, when I'm reading a particularly good piece of prose, I'll stop, go back to the beginning of the paragraph. There's a particularly juicy, beautiful sentence, reread it in my mind, and go, damn you for
Just
being
to
so
really
good.
enjoy it, just to really.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. But I do think a lot about it, and I have a Substack, and I often do small reviews of TV shows or movies and things like that. So it's not a thing I can get rid of. It's really part of my um, my process, and I think quite a bit about how to structure things, and you don't always get it right. That's c'est la vie.
What's
It's
right?
life.
What's right?
Exactly. But I do think about it, but it's when I'm writing, it's I'm nowadays, at the moment, I'm trying to just be in the writing, and to not engage that part. Actually, one of the things I'm really trying to do is to not engage that part of my brain at all when I'm writing, and to just write, and to not second guess myself, and to go weird, go strange, go sideways. I mean,
Yes.
that's just something I'm really trying to work on at the moment.
I mean, that part comes later in the editorial process
Yeah,
anyway.
yeah, yeah.
And it's really interesting, when you're talking about if you start engaging critically with a piece of medium,
Mm,
that that you're watching or listening to, um, then that's bad. That's kind of like you've noticed a flaw that's pulled you out enough that you've started to sort of
mhm.
note the little discrepancies. But I was wondering if sometimes if the sort of plot line is engaging enough, you can really ignore certain things. I mean,
Yeah.
I don't know if you do, because of course you have like there's more like a trained part of you that can
Mm,
kind of approach it more dispassionately. The one thing that I notice in myself is that if I'm enjoying the show for whatever reason, which might be quite separate from the story itself, I might just be
Mm.
in the mood for a particular type of storytelling, and I will explain away all the flaws. And, if I'm watching it with someone and they say, well, that doesn't make sense,
Mm.
my brain will find a way to
Yes,
explain
absolutely.
in
Yeah,
like
yeah.
how it can technically make sense
Yeah,
because
I
I'm
know.
enjoying
Yeah, yeah.
it.
No, I'm the same. It's like if I'm enjoying it, I often go, "Oh yeah, whatever."
Yeah.
And then it's the they describe it. What is it? It's the fridge moment. It's after the movie, and you're going to the fridge, and your brain suddenly goes, "What? What? None of that made any sense." And you go, "Oh, be quiet, brain." I mean, there's a lot to be said for an entertaining spectacle. I love all kinds of movies. As I said, I'm a big fan of action, stupid action movies. I like rom-coms. I like a real variety of movies, and I take them on their terms. That's the other thing.
Mm.
And there are sometimes I watch a movie and I think to myself, well, I wouldn't have made that decision, but guess what? I didn't write that movie. So what I try to do is take it on its terms, like the way they have written it. And you have to know there were all kinds of reasons they made their decisions, and it could have been budget. There could have been an actor who they were who was very difficult, who they had to rewrite the parts for. There's so many things that can happen in
I
a
mean,
film.
I wish that like more people approached art in that way,
Mm,
because I think especially if people are very used to only consuming one type,
mm,
one genre, for example, in
yeah.
books or movies, then when they start watching another genre, they feel like, well, this is a mistake. Clearly, this plot line, this whole plot line is a mistake because
Mm, mm.
they just watch Star Trek and Star Trek adjacent things. So it's like, why is there this romantic storyline without where there should be a spaceship?
Yeah,
And
yeah.
it's really interesting because you do get that kind of more myopic
Mm,
view of art sometimes in people, if, like you said, they don't consume sort of widely enough.
mhm,
And one thing that I sometimes do is I get bored with American movies and TV shows, because like
mhm,
you reach a point where you feel they're all the same, and I start watching en masse French TV shows, for example, or then I get bored with that and I start watching.
mm,
Recently, I went through a phase where I was watching a lot of Korean TV shows, and
mhm.
like you say, you have to take it on their terms, because the conventions of those genres are completely different.
Yeah, they are, and actually, I really enjoy that because kind of wrong foots you because you're like, "Oh, here." I always say to people, they're not aware, but most people have a metronome that's going in their head.
Mm,
It's like tick, 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 enter this element. And you're not aware, you're aware of you being trained. I mean, we consume so much media. I mean, by the age of 5 now, there's just, it's, boo. And you've got video games again. We haven't even talked about video games. There's so many different media. So we become very used to these kind of ticks of when you watch something from France or Scandinavia, or especially in Asia, they have a completely different aesthetic. If you watch Bollywood, very different,
mm.
and they have a different structure, and that's actually really refreshing because you find yourself going, "Well, what's happening
No,
here?"
it's like it's that suddenly you're not expecting it. It's like, in
Yes.
horror where you have this kind of oh, something's going to happen now. I can hear the ominous music,
Hmm,
something,
hmm.
something's going to jump out. And then when it doesn't, that kind of draws your attention, and you sort of, you're pulled into the story a bit more. Because
Yeah,
every time you anticipate something happening, it's almost like taking you out of the storytelling, I think.
yeah,
Especially
yeah.
if it does happen, it's so you're like, oh, this person is going to turn out to be the murderer. And how disappointed are you if this person really does turn out to be the murderer, because you want to be surprised.
Yeah, I do think you do. And it's actually quite hard because, again, we're so literate in movies. So people can anticipate things that writers and directors and have spent a lot of time to make not very obvious. Um, but yeah, most people are very sophisticated. They're not aware of how much they know now when they watch movies, and everyone wants to be the one who can say, "I knew that was going to happen." So yeah,
Yes, but you do. But at the same time, as an audience, you
yeah,
don't want to guess because
mm,
you want to be surprised. You want to
yeah,
be
yeah.
amazed by
Well,
the
I think
clever.
so. Yeah, and actually, the thing you said, I mean, going back and even watching older movies, I think is a
Mm,
phenomenal thing to do because, I mean, there's a great there's again huge range of work you can access, and they do things differently then. And also, I like movies that have a slower pace. Sometimes I think you can become a bit like addicted, to, and
yes.
I think forcing yourself to watch movies that take a slower pace, um, if you don't ever do it, it will feel very alien at first, but then you can sink into it and come to love it. There are some movies that just glide along, and there's not a lot happening, a lot of
Mm.
European art movies, but they're gorgeous and you're just swept away, and they're usually incredibly intense emotionally.
Uh, I
So
I think that's it. Some sort of ties into something you said earlier about the you have to grab people from the beginning, and that is actually, I would say, having sort of studied like history of sort of English literature, and it's quite new. It's quite
mm,
new as a concept. This idea that everything has to start happening from the first sentence, because,
yeah.
and I think we're becoming so impatient.
Hmm. Yeah.
In reading, in consuming sort of videos and media, we expect everything to happen straight away. We want to be grabbed, and if we feel cheated if we're not grabbed immediately. And of course, in novels, in longer medium, you do have that moment. You can be slower, you can be calm, and not everybody will love
Hmm.
it.
Yeah.
But you do have that space. Whereas, of course, like majority of your work is in short form, and
Mm-hmm.
like in comics and your short stories, and that requires a very different kind of rigor. And so I was wondering, like, what originally drew you to those shorter works?
I actually like efficient storytelling. I think it's one of the reasons because if you write a screenplay, the very, very common adage for those who don't know is you have to write very lean, very precise paragraphs, and they need to be short. They cannot be. There's no prose. There's no. But you can do it actually in a very stylistic way, though, which
Hmm.
is to your benefit. So I actually love writing flash fiction. I love writing something really impactful in 500 words or 1000 words. And I have always written into that area, but actually my work is currently evolving out of that and is going longer. But I I'm always looking at a sentence, and again, I think it's just because of the way I've sort of come up is like, how can I tell this in a evocative way, but also in an efficient way? Now, that's me, and there's nothing wrong with that. I know people who write really beautiful prose, and it's quite um, languorous or long, and I like that too. But that's not necessarily my natural state.
Mm.
Um, but that doesn't mean I don't like it. It's just not my natural state. I like to, yeah. But anyway, it's something I've, funny enough that you mentioned this, is something I'm moving along in.
Mhm.
And
You do like to challenge yourself by the
I
sounds of
do,
it, so
and
it
I
does.
Jesus, it's a problem of mine. I cannot tell you how many times I decided to do something different, and halfway through, I was like, "Why did I do that?"
I
I
can
wrote,
relate.
yeah, I wrote a novella, Psyche, which is set in the 2000 AD universe, and I did a two timeline to kind of slightly cheated, but the editors were happy with it and they liked the work. But halfway through, I was like, why? Why did I do it this way? No, just do it straightforward, Maura. But you see, that's boring,
Yes, it is.
you know.
I mean, sometimes, when you get into the kind of work for hire space, or kind
Mm,
of, the working under contract or working to someone else's sort of timeline, people can forget that why we start writing,
mm,
why we start telling stories. And it's, such a need, there's such a need in like the human soul to tell stories. And
absolutely.
it's and this creativity is an expression that is not, it's not originally designed to be monetized. It's something that we are sort of programmed to do. um
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, it's humans are narrative machines. We just keep churning it out. Even people who don't write stories, like just the stories we tell each other on, like,
of course.
yeah, you and I. I mean, Irish people are particularly prone to this. I my
Yes.
my story about Irish people is that if you ask someone for directions, they'll give you a story. So you're just,
I love
no,
that.
I
Yes,
just want to go to the, and they're like, so, and then they'll start telling you all this other information you don't need to know. Now you
so
don't
now
know.
we know where your love of efficiency in communication comes from.
Perhaps. Get to the point. Where
Rebellious,
is the post office?
rebellious.
No, no, yeah.
And on that note, I wish I could be far less efficient and we could continue talking for
That's
a lot
fine.
longer. But we're coming to sort of the end of our time. And again, thank you so much,
Oh,
Maura.
thank you.
It was,
I've really enjoyed it. Thank you.
so if you like the show, please hit the subscribe button. It really helps the channel, and maybe that notification bell too. And see you again next week.